Prague.
Let's do it.
I'm in.
Hey everyone, so here we are outside of a beautiful castle just outside of Frankfurt, and this is our final stop on a road trip we've taken all around many different cities throughout this continent. And we thought let's share some tips from our experience for you so that this would be helpful for you if you're planning your Euro road trip. We went to a number of different places. First, we flew into Frankfurt and we drove from Frankfurt to Nuremberg where we stopped overnight. From there, we then continued to go to Prague, stopped overnight. Then went to Bratislava and Budapest. From there, we went to Vienna. From Vienna up to Passau, and then finally come all the way back around to Frankfurt so that we can catch our flight home. It's a total of 5 countries, which means that's a lot of different places to drive through and tackle and all these kinds of different currencies, all kinds of stuff that you're gonna have to think about if you're taking a road trip through Europe. So with these in mind, let's go ahead and go through some different tips that we thought would be helpful for you. First, the speed limits are different than in the US. So obviously it's a metric system here, so that means everything's in kilometers as opposed to miles per hour. So don't be surprised when you go on the highway, you'll see a little like a white circle with a red ring. They'll say 130. Obviously that's kilometers, it's not 130 miles an hour. But you're also going to see like different areas where maybe it'll drop down to 50, or like a lot of city centers you can only go 50 kilometers an hour, 30 kilometers an hour. And so for us who are coming from the United States, that feels, and it is, very, very slow. It's just how it is, especially there's a lot of pedestrians walking around. So I'd say be prepared to understand that you're going to drive slower than you are probably used to.
What is that? Like, how do you even go 10?
You're speeding.
I think a big tip is just to be aware that in Europe there is a lot of radars. Second tip we want to give for you is road work. Here, summertime, there is a lot of road work, and it's normal. The roads here are in immaculate condition, but it means they have to do a lot of maintenance and things to keep it that way. So yeah, speaking of road work, this is an example where sometimes what happens is you get funneled onto the opposite side of the highway, and all that's between you and oncoming traffic are these little tiny orange things here between the lanes. But this is just kind of part of it. So this way, if you are driving, you'll see this and you'll be prepared. Whenever you see those estimates on Google of like however long it's going to take, really, we would recommend giving yourself at least another 2 hours, just give it a ballpark. Okay, if Google says 2 hours, maybe call it 3, who knows? And worst case, you get there earlier than you planned, and that's great. But it's also good sometimes if you want to just go a little bit and maybe stop along the way. You'll find these little like brown signs on the highway where there's little kind of things you can veer off, scenic overlooks, stuff like that. So you can take your time and stop if you want, assuming you haven't already been bogged down with road work. Okay, next is vignette. So a lot of different countries require what's called a vignette. Now, whenever we were first charting our trip, we saw that on Google there were a lot of toll roads between different points. So what this is essentially a toll. It's like a pass that you pay to drive in the country. We just got to the border of Austria, and this is one of those examples where now we got to buy a vignette, which is kind of like a pass. So right here, we're about to go inside and go buy this so we can continue on our way.
Yeah.
And sometimes what we need is we got to bring the car registration that the rental car company has, as well as what I think is easier is just a photo of the license tag. That way you can just show them what you have. Okay, we just got the vignette. Now in Austria we have to put this on the dash, and this one cost us 12 euros and 50 cents. So that's what it is. So now we have our vignette, which I think she said left side. I think.
It's a bit under.
Let's
see what it looks like. Okay, it looks cool. I don't know.
There it is. I'm not sure. I'm just going to put it in the middle. It's somewhat to the left. The vignette you must get. So, for example, when we left Germany, which did not require a vignette for part of our trip, as soon as we entered the border into Czechia on the way to Prague, that did require a vignette. So we had to buy one. And it sounds scarier than it is. You can actually get it online from the official site. We'll put that in our description just so you have it. There's also a huge line of people out at the border at like these gas stations and things where you can get them. So those vignettes come in different time periods. You can get either 10 days, 1 month, or 1 year, depending on how long you need it. It was only like 12 euros for 10 days for us. That was the shortest amount of time that we could buy. So while we were only going to be in Prague for like 2 days, we had to buy the 10-day one. And it was the same with Slovakia. We were literally just passing through, but we were required to buy one. Again, I think that was another 10 euros. So that brings about an interesting point too, because Germany is on the euro, Czechia is not on the euro. So if you were buying a vignette in an area where it does not accept euros, you can either buy it online in the currency that you want, or just be sure to go ahead and pre-plan. But what we did is we purchased online, except for a couple of occasions. With the vignette, you don't actually have to print anything. They'll just read your license plate and that's it. However, in Austria, they will give you something that you need to put on the dashboard. So that's the one difference with Austria. The others will just, they already have it in their system so that, you know, if there's a police officer who gets behind you, they can scan your license tag and say, ah, yep, they already paid their vignette, and they'll leave you alone.
Okay, so another thing about driving in Europe, and something for you to know, is the cars are kind of quirky. So a tip is just to take some time and be a little bit more familiar with some of these, and to kind of have an expectation that you're gonna run into some things that are very different than some of the things that you've had for your car in the US. So for example, here we have a little shifter. I don't know, I kind of think of this almost like a nub shifter. You know, it's like, okay, let me put it in reverse. Whoop, there we go. And you can see this car is nice. I have a backup camera. And so here we're gonna go backwards. And then now, instead of having a shifter or a bigger shifter, I'm gonna shift again. Bam, here we are. We are there. Sometimes I've also noticed this doesn't turn off right away. Again, little quirk, just depending on the car. So you gotta hit X so you can go where you can see back to the GPS. And that reminds me, by the way, take some time when you first rent your car to make sure that all the little kinks are ironed out. So when we first got this particular car, the GPS was still in German. We had to ask for help and how do we change this to English so that we can understand how do we enter in things properly. Same with the AC. The AC kind of operates very differently in this one. You have to like hit the screen here in order to turn the AC on. And if you do that, then you can use the little buttons. Whereas, you know, usually a lot of cars that we've driven in the US, you can, you know, just turn on and off the thing without having to activate it first through a screen. Whereas this particular one, that was a fun little quirk that we had to figure out. So yeah, just little things like that. Be aware, the cars you're gonna rent, they have some little quirks about them.
Big tip for you is, you know, in Europe, a lot of restrooms are like a lot of public restrooms, you have to have change to pay to use. Whenever you're driving along your way and you need to stop to get gas, likely the gas station is going to require for you to pay to use that restroom. So you always want to have some change in the local currency so that you can go ahead and do what you need to do. In other words, it's not free to pee. The next tip we want to talk about is restrictions. So, you know, it's Europe, and especially when you're dealing with a lot of different countries, even local cities are going to have different restrictions on vehicles within the same country that you may not be aware of, that we didn't know. In fact, part of it actually required us to change part of our trip's itinerary just because of how things are. So in Czechia, to go into Prague, you are not, according to the rental car people, you're not allowed to have a large car. You need to have a very small car. You know, a lot of those roads are very tight and they have some legal restrictions against it if you're renting a car, based on what we were told. So you want to make sure whenever you're talking with the car rental desk that you're letting them know where you're taking the car, and then you want to ask, is this legal to drive in this city? Are there any legal restrictions against this vehicle size in that particular region? And to be honest, unless you are with a giant family or, you know, anything where it's a special situation, you definitely want to get a small car. This is a little Volkswagen Golf. You know, it's a pretty typical size for a vehicle out here. Even this, even though it feels small, that we have to cut some pretty tight corners, and thank God this is small enough because it makes it easy, but otherwise if it was any bigger, I think it'd be a bit more challenging. Also, speaking of restrictions, there's a lot of different cities and municipalities who are beginning to enforce green zone restrictions. So this isn't about agreeing with or disagreeing with those particular laws. It's just about the reality of how that may impact you. So for example, this car, if you look on the lower right corner, you'll see it has a green sticker which has a 4 on it. It means that for Germany, they have these different standards. Different towns are instituting policies in which you cannot drive a car in a certain city center unless that number meets what they require. Now, this car is a pretty economical car. It seems very, efficient in the way that it runs. But what we found out during our trip is that we were planning on going to Munich, but unfortunately for us, Munich recently instituted a new law that took effect a few months before we arrived, where they said any car that's below a 5, so this is a 4, any car that's below a 5, and any car that's a diesel, for example, and pretty much any car you're gonna rent here in Europe is gonna be a diesel. Any of those cars are banned. You're not allowed to drive it into the city center of Munich. If you do drive in there, you risk, I think it's like 150 euro or 120 euro fine as a result. So what we had to do was find a new place to go stop as part of our road trip, which is why we went to Passau. But anyway, the point of the matter is you want to go ahead and check with the different places that you're going to. We have a link in our description that we discovered along the way that will show some of the different places that are instituting things, and you definitely want to ask your rental car about this as well. Whenever you're driving, something to be aware of is what's called a Schengen country and different borders and things. A Schengen country is one you can drive through that more freely. The border is almost kind of like crossing a state. It's not really like crossing into an entirely different country. Sometimes some rental companies do not want you driving their car across another border. It would be similar almost like if you were in the US and you want to rent a car and drive it across to the Mexican or Canadian border. Some companies are not going to be too thrilled about that. They want you to keep it within the US. Here, the equivalent of that would be within the Schengen Zone. That's the way to think about it, really. And whenever you cross, so for example, when we went from Austria to Germany, no one's really checking your ID or checking your passport. You definitely want to have those things with you, but they're not going to pull you over and check for it as you're crossing from one border to the next, as long as you're in one of these Schengen zones. The minute you go to another one, they will check you, but whenever you're in a Schengen zone, they're not going to really ask you for that. We went ahead and always opted for an international driver's license. We weren't required to have one, but I thought it was going to be easier to always get one, where in the unforeseen cases, if you need to have an international driver's license, I would rather have one than not. I went to a local AAA office. It was $35. I just had to take my local state license to the AAA in my state so I could get it. It was no sweat. Same day, you go in, you go out, whatever. Some people may say you don't need the international driver's license. So far in our experience, we haven't needed the international driver's license, but then again, I haven't come across a situation where I've been pulled over or rear-ended by someone. So those are situations where maybe you want to have it just in case. You never know. The next tip for you is about filling stations and currency planning. So in our case, since we went to many different countries, some of these were on the euro and some were not. Now this car is efficient enough to where it wasn't just guzzling diesel fuel, and we could go ahead and plan when we were going to fill up so that we could reduce the number of times we needed to exchange currency and pay for any exchange rates that were unnecessary. Anyway, so for us, we ended up filling in Germany, not having to fill up in Czechia, filling up again in Slovakia because Slovakia is on the euro, not having to fill up in Budapest because Budapest is on a different currency, and then coming and filling up again once we were in Austria because Austria is in the euro. So we were able to actually skip a couple of countries because they're very close, similar to some different states in the US, different areas in the upper East Coast where some of the states are smaller and you can easily get in and out without having to fill up at every state. It's similar like that in some of these regions. So you can go ahead and plan for yourself, where do you want to fill up.
So something else that's a little bit different, I don't know if you can hear me because we're right near a highway, but some places in Europe, they still have this thing where you pump first and then you pay, whereas in a lot of US, it's you pay, you prepay, and then you pump. So that can cause some confusion. I've had some weird looks when I go in to try to prepay. People are like, well, how do I know? You pump first and, whatever. So the point is, sometimes you just come in, you pull up, you pump, and then you pay, just kind of like you used to do. But pay attention to that diesel so you know which kind you need to get. And here you can see, this is what we just got.
I mean, we've driven cars and rented all over France. We've been in Iceland. We've been through Spain, all over Germany now. In these 5 countries, you know, we've rented a lot of cars in Europe, and I think every single time it's been a diesel. It's not something I've requested. It's not even something I really thought about, but every time it's been a diesel. So just so you know, you're basically gonna get a diesel. Another thing to think about is one-way rental fees. For example, ours, we did this ring as part of our road trip, and we were able to save several hundred euros because of some fees that would have been instituted against us had we just gone one way. So for example, had we taken this car from Frankfurt and maybe flown out from, I don't know, let's say, you know, Prague or Budapest, you're going to pay pretty high fees for that. And that fee is not cheap. Sometimes that fee can be up to 500 euros. That's a lot more than what we pay to stay at a place like this. So I would rather save that money, and instead of paying a one-way fee, you could use that to stay at a beautiful place like a castle if you wanted, and have a lot of pocket change left over to go enjoy other things rather than paying something silly like a one-way fee. Okay, so that's a lot of tips, and I really hope that some of these have been helpful for you, so that whenever you're planning your road trip in somewhere in some beautiful place in Europe, you can now know what to expect and have a different way of going about it.